Hey everyone, this is Ms. Saunders here, and today we're going to be talking about the 7 symptoms of unworkable language. Before we get into the 7 symptoms of unworkable language, I just wanted to reiterate an important point about being a writer, which is about the thinking phase. So the thinking phase contributes as much to style as the actual process of writing. Relationships between words, sentences, and paragraphs can be clarified and intensified by thinking through precisely what it is you want to say. I feel like as a young writer, this is something that I personally did not understand. A suggestion someone gave to me once about a creative work is that more important than kind of the daily process of putting words on the page is kind of spending time in the world in which the creative work is taking place, whether that be a novel or a short story. So essentially, basically advocating for me to flush out this process of the thinking phase, to think through exactly what it is you want to say. And then by that time, you'll be able to articulate it formally in the most precise and articulate way possible. So, basically start thinking about assignments or texts that you create far in advance, because the more that you think, the better and easier it will be to write. Okay, so 7 symptoms of unworkable language. We have indulging in the figurative laxity, universalizing, making incompatible connections, violating parallelism in structure and content, escaping in pleasantries, repeating disadvantageously, and pyramiding modifiers. So our first symptom of unworkable language, indulging in the figurative laxity. This wants you to ask you to avoid overused figurative expressions. And examples are figures of speech such as get off the ground, nip in the bud. Another example would be a mixed metaphor. No one tool can sufficiently appraise every factor of company performance. So in this mixed metaphor, I think they're kind of talking about, tools in the shed. It's kind of mixing the metaphor with company performance. When I read a sentence like that, I have to stop and think about what they're trying to say. Kind of like what you would do when you'd read a poem, right? Plenty of mixed metaphors in poetry. But when you're writing professionally, you really don't want people to have to stop and think about and try to parse out what you're saying. You want your message to be very upfront and clear, because time is of the essence. So you really want to try to avoid anything that's going to make your reader pause. And as we go through all these symptoms of unworkable language, every single one of them, the end result is the reader having to stop and kind of do work to figure out what the writer is trying to say. When you remove figures of speech, such as get off the ground, nip in the bud, you're basically removing language which is dead. And language that's not really doing anything because it's so overused in popular culture and popular language that it is essentially empty. And what you're doing is you're adding words or weight to the sentence that aren't really moving the message forward or aren't carrying the message of the meaning of the message in any way. So if you try to avoid overused figurative expressions, it's an easy way to make your writing more concise. And by making your writing more concise, it's a really way to make your writing more interesting, because then your reader is hooked into every single word that you're saying, because every single word that you're saying has weight, it has meaning, and it's important. So, that's something. Indulging the figurative laxity, I think when you use figures of speech, it becomes natural for you, especially as a young writer, and I did this too when I was a young writer, but you want to emanate or write things that you hear, because that's the language that's in your head and it's around. But just, in your revisions, if you can try to remove them, even if you have that impulse added in, it'll make your text a lot stronger. Okay, universalizing. This is risky from the point of accuracy and from the point of reliability. And when I'm grading, especially composition, introduction to college writing essays, I see universalizing a lot. So an example of universalizing is this new drug is in its infancy, and like all anti-cancer available drugs, it is capable of producing serious side effects. So here the problem is it says all anti-cancer available drugs, when really that is not an accurate thing to say, and it detracts from your reliability as an author to make a statement that's inaccurate. And when a reader reads an inaccurate statement like that, again, they have to stop, think about why you might be saying that, and then that results in a lot of questions that they might have about you, which as someone who's creating professional text, you wanted to try to avoid them having. And I think when we universalize in our work, it comes from the point perhaps of you're trying to sound impressive. You are trying to, make a grand connection for your readers, because those connections can be really exciting to read, and you've read them before, but just try to keep in mind that you really need to make sure you're being completely accurate with everything that you say. And if you try to, universalize, you're gonna detract from your own reliability as a narrator. Okay, making incompatible connections. Making incompatible connections, and what we mean by this here is the illogical interrelating of ideas between sentences. Example, because of the difficulty establishing a person's capacity, it is impossible to grade everyone on an individual basis. So here we have the first clause, because of the difficulty establishing a person's capacity, and then we have the second point, it is impossible to grade everyone on an individual basis. For me, again, I have to stop and try to make the connection between the first and the second clause. It doesn't seem obvious to me about how those two comments logically interrelate. Where I think this symptom of unworkable language comes from for us as writers is that we are trying to make connections, right? And make things interesting, kind of the same point of universalizing. And sometimes we rush to things too quickly. We've perhaps thought it all out in our head, but we've forgotten to make the critical connection for our readers. So that is just something to keep in mind when you're writing, or also when you're revising. Sometimes when you make a draft of a text, you might return to it a few days later and realize that you need to spend more time spelling out how these two ideas or these two sentences are actually related. Usually it's just a process of slowing down. Sometimes you might realize that what you've said doesn't completely make sense, and you have to change the idea completely, but that's okay. And that's why it's important to kind of ideally have some time between drafts so you can kind of experience your language fresh, as in, staying away from it for a few days and coming back to it with fresh eyes. All right, violating parallelism in structure and in content. First, let's talk about what is grammar parallelism. So that's writing sentences in the same grammatical structure. So an example of parallelism is, although he had games to play, he wasn't very happy during the quarantine. Then the second example, in which the sentence is structured in a parallel way, or a way that constitutes parallelism. Although the woman owned things, she still wasn't pleased with the free time. So here we have a dependent clause, which starts with although, and then it leads on into the independent clause. And it's structured, with introductory clause and then the comma. So we see how these sentence structures are mimicking each other, right? Parallelism makes sense when you're suggesting two things, when you're talking about two things that are similar. So you're suggesting two ideas that are very similar, it makes sense to construct those sentences in similar ways, because the reader sees a natural connection between content and form. It doesn't cause any questions to arise in their mind about your formal choices, as in your sentence structure or your word choices. However, when you violate parallelism in structure and in content, those questions do come up. Now let's look at examples. So violating parallelism in structure and in content is saying different things in a similar way that is confusing for a reader. So here we have example 1. A financial, product, and legal analysis will be made. So financial, product, and legal are all arranged as if they are very similar modifiers of analysis, as if they are very similar types of analysis. But actually, a financial, product, and legal are actually 3 very distinct terms. So it really makes sense to put them in separate sentences, right, and not arrange them as if they are very similar, right? They're all types of analysis, but they are categorically and distinctly distinct in ways that are important for the reader to understand. Saying it like that, it's kind of like a jump. It causes a jump as I get to product and legal, because as a reader, I'm confused by the author's choices. So example 2, metal, wood, and transportation are necessary to the industry. Sorry about that, that's my phone ringing. Okay, so here we see metal and wood. Okay, those are similar, similar types of things, right? But transportation, so metal and wood, they're both, tangible products, right? When we move to transportation, that's a completely different type of word. Transportation is more, abstract. So again, using parallelism in this way, it causes questions to come up in the reader's mind about the formal choices. Again, you can use parallelism when you're talking about similar things, right? And then it makes sense, and then it's very intuitive for the reader to see your choices and to experience the expression of the idea in that way. Escaping into pleasantries. So this one is specific to professional writing, right? When you're writing a professional text, there's usually someone at the other end of the writing tunnel, as we say. So you want to have, awareness of your readers, and it's important to write towards the positive and away from the negative. However, writers need to consider readers' awareness of the fakeness of excessive pleasantries. It can come off as not genuine and therefore offensive. I've had the experience, this just springs into mind during the pandemic. How do I start a professional email? How do I address someone during this kind of calamitous time? So the important thing to remember is that, it's good to write toward the positive and away from the negative. However, just don't escape too much into the pleasantries. Don't overdo it, because it does come off as false. And that's kind of offensive, because you're kind of, something about the relationship between the reader and the writer is eroding if you go into it too much. So what do readers want if they don't want you to kind of escape into the pleasantries? So they want the flat-footed statement, even if it requires use of the negative article, a genuine, natural approach. And that's not, a genuine, natural approach, that's not something that comes overnight. It takes time and practice to kind of, figure out a way to habituate language in a way that feels natural to you and honest to you. But ideally, that's something that we practice in this course. The writer should keep in mind 2 things: the ultimate objective, which is seldom negative in itself, and the control of emphasis. So even, if you happen to be in the instance where you are delivering bad news or discussing about something negative, it won't necessarily be a good time to escape into excessive pleasantries. You can use a flat-footed statement and a general, natural approach. And just remember that the ultimate objective is seldom negative in itself. And if you control the emphasis of the way you use to describe things, you can mitigate it coming off as fake or perhaps offensive. Repeating disadvantageously. This is probably my #1 thing that I notice in my own writing, especially, but a lot of writing in general. And it's one way that I have found as a writer one way that I found to improve my own writing is to try to avoid doing this. So first, let's talk about what it is. So repetition is necessary, but you can use new words and find new ways to repeat the same content. There can be times when repeating a word is useful to draw emphasis. You ultimately want to repeat ideas, and you need to do so for your reader to understand, but you don't want to do it unintentionally, therefore boring your readers. So this is just an opportunity in your revision process to go back and see if you can notice you using the same words or phrases to describe the same thing. It's okay to say the same thing over and over again in a paper, of course, to an extent. But if you use the same words or the same phrases, it becomes boring, and your writing really can actually be far more impressive if you kind of vary the words and phrases. Of course, there's sometimes some repetition can draw emphasis to a point, and that's important to acknowledge and an important tool for you to use. But for me, it has been such an easy way to improve my writing, which is to just try to give it as much, dictional or language variety as possible. So this is probably my favorite one, and the one that has improved my writing the most personally. Pyramiding modifiers, a classic problem in professional writing, and when I worked as a technical writer, it's one that I saw often. So what is pyramiding modifiers? To save space, modifiers are piled on top of each other. What is a modifier? A word, especially an adjective or noun, used attributively that restricts or adds to the sense of the head noun. Now, in this example below, you'll see that all the modifiers and the head nouns are all italicized, which should show you the great, degree that of which they dominate this sentence. And these are all, examples from the book, as I'm sure that you know. But okay, so example, the index budget profit shown in the budget at the index volume column should be adjusted by the variable profit applicable to the total sales volume variance from the index budget using the total divisional index budget to get variable profit rate. So as you can see, as a reader, same thing with all of them. You slow down, what's happening? That's going to take me a while to, parse out. Even someone who's very familiar with this professional world would probably find this less intimidating, but you can see how for certain audiences, it's just completely confusing. So it's important to note that pyramiding, it often starts out as language used internally with a company and then spreads outwards. But really, if you try to keep it with concrete words, simple sentences, easy transitions between unified paragraphs, that is the better way to try to communicate, as opposed to, you want to just try to avoid pyramiding modifiers in that way, because it slows down your readers, and you want to try to be thinking about, maybe if you use it in an email that's internal within a company, that's okay, but you want to be especially aware of it when you're communicating to people outside your professional niche, because you want to use the concrete words, simple sentences, and then you also want to think about easy transitions between unified paragraphs. And in general, with thinking of this idea of clarity, wordiness and grammatical weakness steal fun from your readers. Wordiness kind of applies to a lot of the symptoms that we talked about today, and grammatical weakness as well causes your readers to question your decisions as an author, which in a professional text is really the last thing that you want. So these revision strategies can be very helpful to keep in mind while you are writing and revising. And I use these revision strategies, and they're really helpful for me. I learned about them after I'd been writing for a long time, and they were still really exceptional, I think. So in professional writing, deadlines can be short, and you will find you lack the time for a full writing process. If you keep these tactics in mind while you revise your work, you'll probably be able to expedite your process. And it's true, you can spend a lot less time revising if you have a solid game plan when you go in. So if you know, hey, I'm going to start looking for these, I know that I have a problem with disadvantageous repetition, so that's the first thing I'm going to look for in my revision. I know that I can use some wordiness sometimes, and that's something I want to look for as well. Or I know that I have a tendency to make incompatible connections, so that's something I want to look for right away. And so I think these can all be very helpful revision strategies. So before we go into this brief exercise that I'd like you guys to do at home, let's just review them really quickly. Indulging in the figurative laxity, universalizing, making incompatible connections, violating parallelism in structure and content, escaping into pleasantries, repeating disadvantageously, pyramiding modifiers. All right, so now we'll go into an exercise, because really the best way to learn is for you guys to apply these ideas. Like, you've heard me and you understand them, but now you can learn through creating or generating. So let's have you guys, my suggestion would be that you will, after you listen to the instructions, you will pause this lecture and complete this exercise where you'll read over the draft of your process essay and look for the symptoms of unworkable language. I bet you'll find at least one. I'm definitely guilty of using, probably at least one every time I write. But really the heart of writing is in your revision practice. So even if your first drafts always have them, if you take them out, it's like they never existed. And then you'll also want to look at a peer's process essay draft on the discussion board. So you're drafting the discussion board and your peer and one of your peers. You can just choose someone at random. So you'll read these two texts, searching for the symptoms of unworkable language. Try to pinpoint exactly where they are happening and recognize how they impair the quality and readability of the text. You don't need to turn anything in. This exercise is for you to practice applying these concepts. Okay, now we'll go to the generating part. After you've searched, if you don't find an example of every symptom of unworkable language, try to practice the bad writing on your own. Practice examples of all the symptoms you don't find in the text. So here I'm asking you, if you read over the two texts and you find that there are still some that you did not see, try making an example on your own, and that's just a way for you to kind of articulate what you've learned so your brain will remember it better. After you finish, reflect on the process. What did you learn? What symptoms did you see the most often? Why is it important to avoid these habits in your own writing? Which one of these do you think you do the most often and why? So if you can figure out, if there's some that you have a tendency to do more, and you'll have a better idea, you'll have a better game plan for revision in the future. All right, everyone. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I wish you the best of luck.